The morning sun peeked through the blinds as Grace rushed to get ready for her hospital shift. She kissed her 4-year-old son Liam goodbye, leaving him with the babysitter who arrived right on time. Grace had been working double shifts lately, determined to finish her medical residency while being a good mom to Liam. It wasn't easy, but she and her husband Thomas had made it work for 8 years. "I left your lunch in the fridge," she called out to Thomas, who was still in the shower. "Don't forget Liam has his playdate at 4. Grace heard a muffled reply and smiled. Despite their busy schedules, they had built a life together. Sure, things weren't perfect, whose marriage was, but they were a team. Or so she thought. 12 hours later, Grace dragged herself through the front door, her feet aching from standing all day in the emergency room. The house was quiet. Too quiet. "Thomas? Liam?" she called out, setting down her heavy bag. The babysitter appeared from the living room, Liam fast asleep in her arms. "He tried to wait up for you," she whispered. Grace took her sleeping boy, noticing something odd. Thomas's car keys weren't on the hook by the door. His coat was missing too. After putting Liam to bed, Grace spotted the envelope on the kitchen counter. Her name was written on it in Thomas's handwriting. The letters slanted and rushed like he couldn't wait to be done with them. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Asterisk Grace, I can't do this anymore. We've been growing apart for years, and we both know it. I've moved out. I'll send for the rest of my things later. I'll contact you about arrangements for Liam asterisk asterisk, Thomas asterisk. That was it. 8 years of marriage reduced to 3 sentences. Grace sank to the kitchen floor, the letter crumpled in her fist. She wanted to scream, but she couldn't risk waking Liam. Instead, she sat there, silent tears streaming down her face as the reality sank in. The next morning, Grace called in sick for the first time in her residency. She couldn't face saving other people's lives when her own had just fallen apart. She made pancakes for Liam, shaped like dinosaurs the way he liked them, and forced a smile when he asked where his daddy was. "Daddy had to go away for work," she said, the lie bitter on her tongue. 2 days later, Thomas's friend Ray came by to pick up some clothes. He couldn't look Grace in the eye. "Is it someone else?" Grace asked quietly while Liam was playing in his room. Ray's silence was answer enough. "Who?" she pressed, needing to know. "Jill," Ray finally muttered, from his office. The pieces clicked into place. The late nights at work, the texting at odd hours, the sudden interest in his appearance. Grace had been too busy, too trusting to see what was happening right under her nose. That night, after Liam was asleep, Grace allowed herself to really cry. She scrolled through photos on her phone, their wedding day, Liam's birth, family vacations. Had Thomas been unhappy in all of them? Had she been so focused on building their future that she'd missed the cracks in their present? A week passed. Thomas sent a formal email about child support and visitation. No apology, no explanation, just cold, practical details from a man she no longer recognized. Grace's mother came to stay, helping with Liam while Grace returned to work. Colleagues noticed her red eyes but didn't pry. She threw herself into her patient's problems, grateful for the distraction from her own. 1 month after Thomas left, Grace sat in her garden watching Liam chase butterflies. Despite everything, her little boy still found joy in simple things. His laughter, so much like his father's, no longer brought her pain but determination. "We're going to be okay," she whispered to herself, feeling stronger than she had in weeks. She didn't know what Thomas and Jill were doing, and for the first time, she realized she didn't care. Grace had a son to raise, a career to build, and a life to reclaim. Thomas had made his choice. Now she would make hers. 2 months after Thomas walked out, Grace sat on the edge of her bathtub, staring at the plastic stick in her trembling hands. 2 pink lines. She blinked hard, thinking maybe her tired eyes were playing tricks on her. But the lines remained, bold and unmistakable. "Mummy, are you okay?" Liam's little voice called through the door, followed by his small fist knocking. Grace quickly wiped her tears. "I'm fine, sweetie, just washing my face. I'll be right out." That night, after tucking Liam into bed with his favorite teddy bear, Grace called her sister Beth. "Pregnant? Aren't you sure?" Beth's voice crackled through the phone. 3 tests, all positive. Grace sank deeper into her couch. "What am I going to do?" I'm barely managing with Liam. Have you told Thomas? Grace laughed, a hollow sound. He made it pretty clear he doesn't want this family. Why would I tell him about another baby? The following week, Grace sat nervously in her doctor's office. As a pediatrician herself, she knew the drill, but being on this side of the examination table felt strange. The ultrasound technician moved the wand across her still flat stomach. Well, that explains your extreme fatigue, the tech said, turning the screen toward Grace. Grace's medical training hadn't prepared her for what she saw. Is that? She couldn't finish the sentence. Triplets, the technician confirmed with a smile. 3 healthy heartbeats. Grace felt the room spin. 1 baby would have been challenging enough. But 3? Plus Liam. All while finishing her residency. Without a partner? She stumbled out to her car afterward and sat there for a long time, hands gripping the steering wheel though the engine remained off. 4 children. She would be a mother of 4. That evening, Grace tried calling Thomas. His phone went straight to voicemail. She tried again the next day. Nothing. Finally, she sent a text. *, we need to talk. It's important *. 3 days later, Thomas replied. *, whatever it is, talk to my lawyer *. Grace threw her phone across the room. It bounced off the sofa and onto the carpet. Liam looked up from his coloring book, eyes wide. Sorry, buddy, Grace said, forcing a smile. Mommy dropped her phone. She picked it up, checking for cracks, and made a decision. Thomas had chosen his path. He'd made it clear he wanted no part of their lives. She would not beg him to be involved. The next day, Grace called her parents. We're moving in with you, her mother announced after hearing the news. No arguments. Mom, I can't ask you to. You didn't ask. We offered. Dad's already looking at flights. Tears of relief streamed down Grace's face. Maybe she could do this after all. Weeks passed. Grace's belly grew. She adjusted her scrubs, grateful for the loose fit that hid her changing body from gossiping colleagues. She hadn't told the hospital yet, wanting to wait until she had a solid plan. One evening, as she helped Liam build a fort from sofa cushions, her phone buzzed. A text from Ray, Thomas's friend. * Thomas and Jill got engaged. Thought you should know before you see it online *. Grace set her phone down. Oddly, she felt nothing, no anger, no jealousy, not even sadness. Thomas seemed like a character from a book she'd read long ago. Mom, you're not helping with the fort. Liam complained, tugging at her sleeve. Grace smiled at her son, her oldest son now. She placed a hand on her growing belly, feeling a flutter of movement. Sorry, Captain, she said, saluting Liam. Back to work. That night, Grace sat at her kitchen table, making lists. She'd need 3 cribs, triple the diapers, a larger car. The challenges seemed endless, but as she wrote, a strange calm settled over her. These babies hadn't asked to be born into such complicated circumstances, neither had Liam, but they had her, and she would be enough. Thomas had walked away from 1 child. Now there would be 4 who shared his blood, his features, his name. But they would have her heart, her strength, her love. And that, Grace decided, would make all the difference. 5 years flew by in a blur of first steps, first words, and not nearly enough sleep. Grace stood in her kitchen, packing lunchboxes while keeping an eye on the clock. School drop-off was in 30 minutes, and no one was dressed yet. Liam, come help your brothers with their shoes. She called up the stairs. At 9 years old, Liam had become her little helper, stepping up in ways that sometimes made her heart ache. No child should have to grow up so fast. Thundering footsteps answered her call as all 4 children appeared. Liam led the charge, already dressed in his soccer uniform for the tournament later that day. Behind him, the 5-year-old triplets followed in various states of readiness. Mikey won't wear his blue shirt, Liam reported, guiding his youngest siblings into the kitchen. Grace looked at the triplets, Mikey, Max, and Molly, and felt the familiar mix of exhaustion and amazement. There were small tornadoes of energy, each with their father's green eyes and dimpled chin. Sometimes it was like looking at miniature versions of Thomas. Blue shirt makes me itchy, Mikey declared, crossing his arms. Grace kneeled to his level. How about the green one with the dinosaur? Crisis averted, she loaded everyone into her minivan, the practical replacement for her old compact car. As she drove, she mentally reviewed her day, drop kids at school, finish paperwork at the pediatric clinic where she now worked part-time, pick up kids, soccer tournament, dinner, baths, bedtime stories, then finally collapse. Thomas sent child support for Liam, the bare minimum required by law. He had never asked about the triplets, and Grace had never told him. Their only communication happened through lawyers. Liam saw his father once a month, returning from these visits quiet and withdrawn. Grace had moved them to a neighboring town, far enough from Thomas that they didn't risk running into him, but close enough that Liam's visits weren't a hardship. She built a new life centered around her children and her work. Her parents had stayed for the triplets' first 2 years before returning to their own home, though they visited often. At the clinic that afternoon, Grace's colleague Pat handed her a coffee. "You look like you need this." 3 5-year-olds and a 9-year-old with a soccer tournament? You bet I do. Pat shook her head in admiration. "I don't know how you do it." Grace shrugged. "One day at a time." She didn't mention the nights she cried into her pillow, or the times she'd locked herself in the bathroom for 5 minutes of peace. Those moments were getting fewer, though. It was getting easier. Later at the soccer field, Grace cheered as Liam's team took the field. The triplets sat beside her on a blanket, munching snacks and occasionally shouting, "Go Liam," without really understanding the game. "Which one is our brother?" Molly asked, squinting at the field. "Number 12, Grace reminded her. "See his blue socks." The game was exciting, with Liam scoring a goal in the first half. Grace jumped up, cheering wildly while the triplets danced around her. She was so focused on the game that she didn't notice the man who had frozen at the edge of the field, staring at her family with shock written across his face. It wasn't until halftime when Liam ran over for water that Grace spotted him. Thomas, standing 30 feet away, his face pale as he looked from Liam to the triplets and back again. Grace instinctively gathered the triplets closer. They'd never met their father, didn't even know his name. To them, families with just one parent were normal. Thomas took a step toward them, then another. He looked exactly the same, Grace thought, except for new lines around his eyes and gray touching his temples. "Daddy," Liam called, noticing his father. He ran to Thomas, giving him a quick hug before returning to his team for the second half. Thomas barely seemed to notice his oldest son. His eyes were fixed on the triplets, who stared back curiously. Grace saw the exact moment realization dawned on his face, the same green eyes, the same dimpled smile, the same small cleft in their chins. All features that had skipped Liam but appeared identically in each of the triplets. Thomas's mouth opened, but no words came out. The color drained from his face as he counted, 1, 2, 3, plus Liam 4. 4 children who looked just like him. Thomas couldn't move. His legs felt rooted to the ground as he stared at the 3 small children sitting beside Grace. The noise of the soccer game faded away, replaced by a rushing sound in his ears. Those children, they looked exactly like his childhood photos. The same cowlick in their hair, the same slightly pointed ears, the same dimple that appeared only on the left cheek. Features so uniquely his that there was no mistaking who their father was. "Uncle Tom, did you see my goal?" A boy tapped at his sleeve, his nephew Danny, the reason he'd come to this tournament in the first place. Thomas had been helping his brother coach Danny's team. "Yeah, great job," Thomas mumbled, his eyes never leaving Grace and the triplets. "Who are you looking at?" Danny followed his gaze. "No one," Thomas said quickly. "Go back to your team. I'll be there in a minute." On the sidelines, Grace was painfully aware of Thomas's stare. She busied herself wiping juice from Molly's chin, straightening Max's hat, checking Mikey's shoelaces, anything to avoid looking in his direction. "Mommy, who's that man looking at us?" Molly asked, her voice carrying in the momentary quiet between plays. "Just someone watching the game, sweetie." The second half started, drawing everyone's attention back to the field. Grace breathed a sigh of relief. Maybe Thomas would leave. Maybe he wouldn't connect the dots. Maybe. "They're mine, aren't they?" Grace jumped. Thomas stood behind her, his voice low so only she could hear. She turned slowly, keeping her body between him and the triplets. "This isn't the time or place, Thomas." "How old are they?" His voice shook. 5. Thomas did the math quickly. "You were pregnant when I left." Yes. Why didn't you tell me? His face flushed with anger. Grace laughed, a short, bitter sound. I tried. You sent me to your lawyer, remember? On the field, Liam's team scored again. The triplets jumped up, cheering without understanding why. Thomas stared at them, taking in every detail of their faces. What are their names? He asked, his voice softer now. Michael, Maxwell, and Molly. Grace watched his face carefully. I call them Mikey, Max, and Molly. Do they know about me? They know Liam has a dad he sees sometimes. They've never asked about their own. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit Grace remembered well. I have 3 more kids. 3, and you kept them from me for 5 years. Grace felt her temper rise. Kept them from you? You walked out on us. You ignored my calls and messages when I tried to tell you I was pregnant. A few nearby parents turned to look. Grace lowered her voice. You made it very clear you wanted a new life with Jill. Well, congratulations. You got it. Does she know? Thomas asked. Jill? How would she? I've never met the woman. The triplets were watching them now, curious about the stranger talking to their mother. Max, always the boldest, stood up and walked over. Are you Liam's daddy? He asked, looking up at Thomas with eyes identical to his own. Thomas seemed unable to speak. He nodded. Max considered this. Max. That's Mikey and that's Molly. We're triplets. That means we were born on the same day. I know what triplets are, Thomas said softly, kneeling to the boy's level. It's nice to meet you, Max. Across the field, a woman in designer sunglasses was walking toward them. Jill. She'd come to watch Danny's game too. Grace saw the moment Jill noticed Thomas talking to a strange woman and 3 children. Saw her pause, head tilted in confusion. Then Jill came closer, close enough to see the unmistakable resemblance between Thomas and the triplets. Jill stopped dead in her tracks, sunglasses sliding down her nose as she stared. Thomas? She called out, her voice high and tight. What's going on? Thomas stood up slowly, looking from Grace to Jill, from the triplets to Liam on the field. His carefully separated worlds were colliding, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. I think, he said quietly, we all need to talk. The local coffee shop wasn't the ideal place for this conversation, but it was neutral ground. Grace sat stiffly in the corner booth, watching the triplets coloring at a nearby table. Liam had gone home with her mother after his game, still buzzing from his team's victory and unaware of the storm brewing among the adults. Thomas and Jill sat across from Grace. Jill hadn't spoken a word since they'd arrived, her face locked in an expression somewhere between shock and anger. She kept glancing at the triplets, then back at Thomas, as if confirming their resemblance with each look. I don't understand how this happened, Thomas finally said, breaking the heavy silence. Grace raised an eyebrow. I think you know exactly how it happened. That's not what I meant. Thomas lowered his voice. How could you hide 3 children from me for 5 years? I didn't hide them. You chose not to be in their lives. I didn't know they existed. A few heads turned toward their table. Jill placed a warning hand on Thomas's arm. Keep your voice down, she hissed. Grace sipped her coffee, trying to stay calm. She'd rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times over the years, imagining all the things she would say if she ever faced Thomas again. But now that the moment had arrived, she felt oddly empty. I tried to tell you, she said simply. When I found out I was pregnant, I called you, multiple times. You never answered. I texted you saying we needed to talk. You told me to contact your lawyer. Thomas rubbed his face. I thought you were just trying to get me to come back. Would that have been so terrible? The words slipped out before Grace could stop them. Jill stiffened. Her wedding ring caught the light as she tightened her grip on her cup. That's not fair, Thomas said. Our marriage was over. Our marriage wasn't over. You ended it. There's a difference. Grace leaned forward. But that's ancient history now. I didn't come here to rehash the past. I came because you saw the triplets, and now we need to figure out what happens next. Thomas glanced at the children, who were happily scribbling away, oblivious to the tension. They're beautiful, he said softly. They look just like my baby pictures. I know. Despite everything, Grace felt a twinge of sympathy for him. The triplets were wonderful children. Thomas had missed out on so much. "Do they have any health issues I should know about?" he asked. "Mickey has asthma. Molly had ear tubes put in last year. Max is healthy as a horse." Thomas nodded, filing away the information. "And they're doing well in school. They're in kindergarten. Molly loves reading. The boys are more into building things." As they talked, Jill's expression grew increasingly dark. Finally, she set down her cup with a sharp click. "This is crazy," she said. "You can't possibly expect us to suddenly take on 3 more children." "I don't expect anything," Grace replied evenly. "We've managed fine for 5 years." "Then why are we even having this conversation?" Jill demanded. Thomas turned to her, surprised. "Because they're my kids, Jill. Kids you never knew about. Kids she kept from you." Jill pointed at Grace. "And now we're supposed to what? Split our time 4 ways instead of 1. Pay for college for 4 instead of 1. Thomas looked uncomfortable. "We'll figure it out." "Figure it out?" Jill laughed, a brittle sound. "You should be furious with her, not making plans." "I am angry," Thomas admitted, glancing at Grace. "But they're innocent in all this." Jill stood abruptly. "I need some air." She walked out, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully as she left. Thomas watched her go with a pained expression. "She's just shocked," he explained. "We've been trying to have a baby for 2 years. No luck so far." Grace hadn't known that. She felt a surprising pang of sympathy for Jill. Across the room, Molly looked up from her coloring book. "Mommy, I'm hungry." "We'll get home soon, sweetie," Grace promised. She turned back to Thomas. "Look, I didn't expect this either. I certainly didn't plan for the triplets to meet you today. But now that they have, we need to think about what's best for them." Thomas nodded slowly. "I want to be in their lives," he said. "I don't know how that looks exactly, but I want to know them." Outside the window, they could see Jill pacing on the sidewalk, phone pressed to her ear. "Your wife might have other ideas," Grace observed. Thomas sighed. "Let me deal with Jill. This is a lot for her to take in." "And for you," Grace added. "And for you 5 years ago." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, Grace saw genuine regret in his face. "I'm sorry, Grace, for how I left, for not answering when you tried to reach me. I was a coward." It was the first apology she'd heard from him in 5 years. Grace hadn't realized how much she'd needed to hear those words. "Thank you for saying that," she said quietly. Thomas looked at the triplets again, his gaze lingering on each small face. 4 kids, he whispered, more to himself than to Grace. "I have 4 kids." The weeks following the soccer tournament felt like walking through quicksand for everyone involved. Thomas came to Grace's house that Saturday, sitting awkwardly on the edge of the couch while the triplets stared at him with curious eyes. "So you're our dad?" Mikey asked, getting straight to the point in that blunt way 5-year-olds often do. Thomas nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, I am." "Where have you been?" Max demanded. Thomas looked at Grace, panic in his eyes. Grace stepped in. "Remember how we talked about how some families are different? How Liam sees his dad sometimes, but you 3 haven't met yours yet." The triplets nodded solemnly. "Well, your dad didn't know about you until now," Grace explained, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes and miss important things." "Like when I lost my shoe at the park?" Molly asked. Grace smiled. "Something like that, but bigger." Thomas spent an hour with them that day, answering their endless questions and trying to connect. He brought gifts, stuffed animals that the triplets accepted with cautious excitement. When he left, he sat in his car for a long time before driving away. At home, things with Jill were falling apart. That night, Thomas found her packing a suitcase. "What are you doing?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. "Staying with my sister for a while." Jill didn't look at him. "I need time to think." "Jill, please." 3 more kids, Tom." 3. She finally met his eyes. "Do you have any idea what this means? Our whole life just changed. They're my children. I can't ignore them now that I know." "I'm not asking you to." Jill zipped her suitcase with a sharp final sound. "But I didn't sign up for this." "You signed up for me, for better or worse." Jill laughed, a hollow sound. "Don't throw our vows at me. Not when you broke every promise you made to her first." The accusation hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had no defense. Jill left that night. Thomas rattled around their house alone, looking at the spare bedroom they'd been planning to turn into a nursery someday. Now there were 3 children already in the world who shared his blood, his features, his name. At work, Thomas couldn't focus. His law practice suffered as he spent hours staring at his computer, scrolling through photos Grace had reluctantly shared. Birthdays, first steps, first days of preschool. 5 years of memories he'd never be able to reclaim. His brother found him at his desk one evening, surrounded by these digital ghosts. "You look terrible," Pete said, dropping into the chair across from him. "Thanks." Thomas rubbed his tired eyes. Jill called Diane. Pete's wife and Jill had always been close. "She's pretty torn up." "I know." "What are you going to do?" Thomas shook his head. "I have no idea. I keep thinking about how I left Grace. How I wouldn't even talk to her when she tried to reach me." Pete was silent for a moment. You know what Mom would say. Their mother, who had raised them with a fierce sense of responsibility, would have been horrified by Thomas's actions. "Yeah, she'd tell me to step up and be a father." "So that's what you do," Pete said simply. The next day, Thomas called his lawyer to revise the child support arrangement. The amount quadrupled, but he didn't hesitate. It was the least he could do. Jill returned home a week later, her eyes red but her voice steady. "I've been thinking," she said as they sat at their kitchen table. "About the kids." Thomas waited, afraid to hope. "I'm still angry," Jill continued. "At you, at her, at the whole situation. But those children didn't ask for any of this." "No, they didn't. If you want to be in their lives, I won't stand in your way." She twisted her wedding ring nervously. "But I don't know if I can be a stepmother to 4 kids. I just don't know." It wasn't the answer Thomas wanted, but it was honest. He reached for her hand, relieved when she didn't pull away. "One day at a time," he said. Meanwhile, Grace was dealing with her own challenges. Liam had become sullen and withdrawn since learning about Thomas's visits with the triplets. "It's not fair," he said one night as Grace tucked him in. "He left us, and now he gets to come back just because of them." "Oh, sweetie." Grace sat on the edge of his bed. "Your dad made mistakes, but he loves you." "Then why did he leave?" It was the question Grace had dreaded for years. She had no good answer. "Sometimes grown-ups make bad choices that hurt the people they love," she said finally. "It doesn't mean they stopped loving them." A year passed, marked by small steps forward and occasional steps back. The leaves were turning golden again as Grace sat on a park bench watching the children play. All 4 of them were climbing on the jungle gym, Liam keeping a watchful eye on his younger siblings. "They're getting so big," Thomas said, sitting down beside her with 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed one to Grace. "Thanks." She accepted the cup, noting how this simple exchange no longer felt awkward. Time had smoothed some of their jagged edges. Thomas looked better than he had in months. The dark circles under his eyes had faded, and he'd stopped hunching his shoulders as if carrying an invisible weight. "Molly lost another tooth last night," Grace told him. The tooth fairy brought her $2. "Inflation." Thomas joked, and they both smiled. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the children. So much had changed in a year. Thomas now saw all 4 children twice a week and every other weekend. The schedule that had once seemed impossible to coordinate had gradually become routine. Liam had been the toughest challenge. His anger toward his father ran deep, and it had taken months of patience, plus some sessions with a kind child psychologist before he'd even speak to Thomas during visits. But last weekend, he'd actually asked if Thomas would help him practice for baseball tryouts. It was a tiny olive branch, but an important one. "How's Jill?" Grace asked, surprising herself with the question. A year ago, she couldn't have imagined caring about the answer. Thomas sighed. "Moving forward. The divorce will be final next month." Despite his efforts, his marriage hadn't survived the upheaval. Jill had tried. She'd even come to a few of the children's birthday parties, but in the end, she'd decided she wanted a different life than the one Thomas now had. "I'm sorry," Grace said, and meant it. Whatever her feelings about how Thomas had left her, she took no joy in his pain. "It's for the best," Thomas replied. "We want different things." She's already talking about moving back east to be closer to her family. "And what do you want?" Grace asked, looking at him directly. Thomas watched the children playing. "This," he said simply. "I want to be a father to my kids. All of them. I wasted so much time already." Grace nodded. His actions over the past year had proven his words. He'd rearranged his work schedule to make time for school events and doctor appointments. He'd moved to a house just 10 minutes from Grace's, with a bedroom for each child during their stays. He'd shown up consistently, even when Liam refused to talk to him or when the triplets were sick and cranky. "Hey, Dad, watch this," Max called from the top of the slide. Thomas gave him a thumbs up, his face lighting up at being called Dad so easily now. It had taken months before any of the triplets used the word. "Remember their first day of first grade?" Grace asked. "How Mikey wouldn't let go of your leg." Thomas laughed. "And you had to pry his fingers off while I tried not to cry myself." These shared memories were still new, still precious. They were building a different kind of family now, not the one Grace had once imagined, but one that worked for their children. "Oh, I almost forgot," Thomas said, reaching into his pocket. "Liam's science project won first place yesterday during your hospital shift." He handed her his phone, showing a photo of Liam proudly standing next to his volcano display, Thomas's arm around his shoulders. Grace smiled at the image. A year ago, Liam would never have allowed Thomas to be in the picture, let alone with his arm around him. "He worked so hard on that," she said. "He gets that from you. The brains and the determination." Grace felt a small flush of pleasure at the compliment. She and Thomas weren't friends, exactly, but they had developed a mutual respect that made co-parenting possible. Across the playground, Molly fell and scraped her knee. Before Grace could even stand up, Thomas was already jogging over. He knelt beside his daughter, examining the injury with exaggerated seriousness that soon had her giggling instead of crying. He pulled a bandage from his pocket. He'd learned to always carry them, and carefully placed it on her knee before helping her up. Watching him with their daughter, Grace felt an unexpected tightness in her chest. Not love, that door had closed long ago, but something like peace. The man who had once walked away from his family had finally grown into the father their children deserved. Later, as they were gathering backpacks and water bottles to head home, Liam approached his father. "Dad," he said, still using the word cautiously, "can we stop for ice cream on the way to your house?" Thomas glanced at Grace, silently asking permission. She nodded. "Absolutely," Thomas told his son. "Your brothers and sister will like that too." Liam hesitated, then said, "I was thinking maybe just you and me this time, before we pick them up." Thomas's face registered surprise, then joy. "That sounds perfect." As they walked to the parking lot, the triplets running ahead while Liam and Thomas followed behind, deep in conversation, Grace felt the last piece of bitterness she'd been carrying dissolve. Their story hadn't followed the path she'd once dreamed of. There had been heartbreak and anger, secrets and regrets. But standing here now, watching her children with their father, Grace knew they had finally found their way to where they needed to be. Not a perfect ending, but a real one. And sometimes that was better.